The Galactic Hegemony's victory over the Sol system had been fast and brutal. From high orbit, their warships, great black shapes like shards of night, blocked out the sun over Earth. Cities that once sparkled with light now lay in ruins, wrapped in smoke and silence. The Hegemony, a vast alliance of old alien races led by the reptilian Cathar Dominion, had crushed human resistance in less than 3 standard cycles. Their commanders were sure it was over. Another loud, proud species finally brought to its knees. On the ground, life had changed in ways no one could have imagined. People were moved from their homes into large fenced zones marked by tall towers and armed patrols. Food came in gray packets. Water was rationed. Every day, Hegemony overseers walked through the lines of humans, scanning faces, checking IDs, and taking notes. They spoke in sharp clicks and hisses, their voices cold and mechanical through translation devices. To them, humans were just another resource, useful for labor but not worth respect. In Sector 9, a part of what used to be Chicago, a man named Kyle kept his head low. He was thin with tired eyes and oil-stained hands. He worked in a repair bay, fixing broken communication units that the Hegemony had taken from old military bunkers. He never argued, never looked an overseer in the eye. But he watched everything. He noticed how the patrols changed shifts, how the power lines ran under the streets, how some humans whispered in code when they thought no one was listening. Kyle had not always been a mechanic. Years ago, he served on the frigate Aurora Dawn, one of the last human ships to fight in the outer system. He remembered the alarms, the shaking deck, the final order to abandon ship. He'd made it back to Earth in a life pod, half dead from radiation burns. Since then, he'd stayed quiet, surviving day by day. But inside, he still carried the fire of someone who had once sworn to protect his world. Not far from Kyle's repair bay, a woman named Lena organized the daily food lines. She had been a school teacher before the war, teaching history and literature to kids in a small town near the Rockies. Now she stood in the same spot every morning, handing out nutrient paste and bottled water, her voice calm even when the line grew restless. She kept the children close, telling them stories about Earth's oceans, mountains, and stars, things many of them had never seen. Lena didn't carry weapons or secrets, but she carried memory. And in a time when the Hegemony tried to erase human culture, memory was a kind of rebellion. She taught the children old songs, showed them how to write their names in English, and reminded them that Earth was more than rubble. It was a home worth remembering. One afternoon, a Hegemony patrol found something deep beneath an old subway station. It was a hidden room, sealed behind a false wall. Inside were crates of old rifles, power cells, and encrypted data drives. The find sent shockwaves through the occupation command. Within hours, squads swept through Sector 9, dragging people from their shelters. Anyone with a military record, anyone who had worked in tech or defense was taken for questioning. Kyle was among them. He hadn't touched a weapon in years, but his old service ID had been found in a drawer. Lena was taken too, not because she'd done anything, but because she'd been seen talking to former soldiers and had access to old-school records that listed emergency contacts from the defense network. They were marched to a processing center under heavy guard. There they stood in a cold room with metal floors and flickering lights. A tall Cathar officer entered, his scales glinting under the harsh bulbs. His name was Commander Vraktail, and he had led the final assault on Mars. His voice, even through the translator, dripped with contempt. "You humans," he said, pacing slowly. "You fight like animals. You build like children, and yet you think you deserve to stand among the great species of the galaxy." He stopped in front of Kyle. "You had your chance. You lost." Kyle said nothing. He kept his eyes on the floor. Vraktail turned to Lena. "And you? You spread lies to the young. You fill their heads with dreams of a world that no longer exists." Lena met his gaze. "I teach them who they are," she said quietly. "That's not a lie." The commander's tail twitched in anger. He ordered them both sentenced to labor aboard the Iron Maw, the Hegemony's flagship. It was a floating fortress, larger than some cities and known for breaking even the strongest wills. Most humans sent there never returned. The next morning, Kyle and Lena were loaded onto a transport shuttle with 20 others. As the ship lifted off, Kyle looked out the small window. Below, Earth shrank into a blue and brown marble, half hidden by storm clouds. He thought of the Aurora Dawn burning up in the void. He thought of his crew. He thought of Rule Nar 2. He hadn't spoken of it in years. No one had. But it was still there, buried deep in every human who had lived through the war. The shuttle docked with the Iron Maw hours later. The air inside the ship was thick with the smell of ozone and something sour, like old metal and alien sweat. They were stripped of their clothes, given gray uniforms, and assigned numbers instead of names. Kyle became Unit 884. Lena became Unit 885. Guards led them through winding corridors lit by pulsing red strips. Strange machines hummed behind glass walls. Alien workers, some insect-like, some furred, some with too many eyes, moved quickly, never looking at the humans. Kyle noticed something as they walked. The control panels on the walls, the wiring in the ceilings, even the shape of the door locks, they all felt oddly familiar. Not exactly human, but close, like someone had studied Earth tech and tried to copy it without understanding why it worked the way it did. He filed that thought away. Lena, meanwhile, kept her eyes open for anything that looked like a terminal or a data port. If they were going to survive this place, they would need information. And if there was one thing humans were good at, it was finding ways to talk, even when the enemy thought they'd been silenced. That night, in their cramped sleeping cells, neither of them slept. They listened to the groans of the ship, the distant clang of metal, the low hum of engines that never stopped. Somewhere in the dark, a human voice whispered an old lullaby. Lena closed her eyes and remembered her classroom, full of light and laughter. Kyle stared at the ceiling and wondered if anyone back on Earth still remembered the rules. The war might have looked over to the hegemony. But for humans, it had only just changed shape. Life aboard the Iron Maw was harder than anything Kyle or Lena had known on Earth. The ship was a maze of cold metal, flickering lights, and constant noise. Humans were treated like broken tools, used until they snapped, then tossed aside. They were given just enough food to stay alive and just enough rest to work another shift. Talking was punished. Looking up too long was punished. Even breathing too loud could earn a shock from the overseer's baton. Kyle was assigned to the engine maintenance crew. His job was to crawl through narrow service tunnels and check plasma conduits for leaks. The heat was unbearable and the air smelled like burnt wire and acid. His hands were raw from handling sharp edges and his back ached from hours bent in tight spaces. But he didn't complain. Instead, he watched. He learned the rhythm of the ship, the way power surged every 6 hours, the pattern of guard patrols, the sound the coolant pumps made when they were about to fail. What surprised him most was how much of the ship's inner workings felt familiar. The connectors on the main junction boxes used a twist-lock design almost identical to old Terran models. The diagnostic ports accepted a 3-prong input that matched Earth's pre-war standard. Even the error codes flashed in a sequence he recognized from his time on the Aurora Dawn. It was as if the hegemony had scavenged human tech after earlier battles and tried to rebuild it without understanding the logic behind it. They copied the shape but missed the soul. Lena's fate was different. Because she could read and write clearly, and because her records showed she once handled data systems in her school, the hegemony put her to work in the archive wing. Her job was to sort through digital fragments recovered from Earth, old emails, school records, news clips, even children's drawings scanned into databases. Most of it was labeled cultural debris and marked for deletion, but Lena was told to flag anything that might contain hidden codes or military references. She spent her days at a dim terminal, scrolling through broken files. At first it felt pointless, but then she noticed something strange. Certain phrases kept appearing even in unrelated files. Project Sentinel. Final Directive. And once buried in a corrupted teacher's lesson plan, the words, Omega Rules, C Rule Number 2. Her heart jumped. She remembered hearing whispers of the Omega Rules during the last days of the war. They weren't laws or commands. They were more like promises, things every human was supposed to carry in their heart no matter how dark things got. Rule number 1 was about never giving up hope. Rule number 3 was about protecting the future. But rule number 2, no one ever said it out loud. It was the one you only spoke when everything else had failed. She wanted to dig deeper, but the system was locked. Every time she tried to access the full file, it vanished or showed an error. Still, she memorized every fragment she could. Days passed. Kyle and Lena rarely saw each other. The ship kept them separated by duty and design. But fate has a way of bending even the strongest walls. One afternoon, a minor explosion in the reactor wing sent alarms blaring through the lower decks. Coolant pipes had ruptured, spraying toxic vapor into 3 sectors. All non-essential workers were ordered to evacuate, and even some guards were pulled away to help contain the leak. In the chaos, Kyle was sent to reroute power through a backup conduit near the archive wing. As he crawled out of a maintenance hatch, he saw Lena dragging a heavy data crate down a corridor, her face streaked with sweat. For a moment, they just stared at each other. Then Kyle nodded toward an empty service closet. Lena hesitated, glanced both ways, and followed. Inside, the air was stale but quiet. Kyle spoke in a low voice. "You've seen it too, haven't you? The way their tech copies ours but doesn't work right." Lena nodded. "They think they understand us because they took our cities. But they don't know what we built into everything." Kyle reached into his pocket and pulled out a small scratched data chip. "I found this near the main reactor. It's got schematics of the Iron Maw's core, human-style labeling hidden behind their code." "Someone on Earth planned for this." Lena's eyes widened. "Project Sentinel," she whispered. It wasn't just a rumor. Before they could say more, boots echoed in the hallway. They slipped out just as a pair of Cathar guards rounded the corner. Kyle went back to the engine tunnels. Lena returned to her terminal, her mind racing. That night, during a rare, unsupervised break, Lena plugged the chip into a secondary port on her station. The screen flickered, then displayed a simple map of the Iron Maw, with layers of hidden pathways, emergency overrides, and one blinking red marker labeled Core Broadcast Node. Below it, in small letters, was a phrase, "Rule Nur-2 activates when silence ends." She didn't understand it all, but she knew one thing. Humans had left traps not of weapons but of meaning, and the hegemony had walked right into them. Over the next few days, Kyle used his access to subtly reroute coolant flow away from non-critical systems. It caused small confusing fluctuations in the ship's temperature logs, just enough to keep engineers busy but not enough to raise alarms. Meanwhile, Lena began copying fragments of the Omega Directive onto blank maintenance logs, hiding them in plain sight among routine reports. They couldn't talk again for nearly a week. But when they finally crossed paths near a waste disposal chute, Kyle slipped her a folded note. It read, "They think this ship is theirs, but it remembers Earth." Lena tucked it into her sleeve and gave him the smallest smile. Far away, beneath the ice of Earth's Arctic, something deep underground stirred. A machine older than the war, older than the cities that had fallen, detected a faint signal, a repeating pulse from the Iron Maw, matching an old human distress cipher. It was weak but clear. The machine, known only as Warden, powered up its dormant systems. Lights blinked on in a vault that had been dark for years. Across its screens, words scrolled slowly. Protocol echo initiated. Somewhere in the void between stars, a derelict cargo hauler named Dawn Chaser shifted in its silent orbit. Its engines were dead, its crew long gone. But deep in its core, a single command activated, and for the first time in years it began to broadcast. Kyle didn't hear it yet, but he would, and when he did, he would know the war wasn't over. It had just found its voice again. Deep beneath the Arctic ice where the world above had burned and broken, a silent place waited. It was called Site Theta, built during the resource wars of the 22nd century when nations feared the sky would fall. Hidden under 2 miles of ice and shielded by layers of quantum-locked steel, it had survived the hegemony's orbital strikes without a scratch. No bombs had touched it. No scanners had found it. To the galaxy, it did not exist. Inside, the air was still and cold. Rows of dormant servers lined the walls, their lights dark for years. At the center of the chamber sat a single console, and on it a soft blue glow pulsed slowly, like a heartbeat. This was Warden, the site's artificial mind. It had no face, no voice, only purpose. Its last command, given by a human general with blood on his uniform and fire in his eyes, was simple. Watch, wait, wake when Earth calls. For months after the fall, Warden heard nothing but static. Then 3 days ago a signal came through, a weak repeating pulse from deep space. It matched an old human emergency cipher, one used only by ships that carried Omega-level clearance. The source was the Iron Maw. And the message, though fragmented, carried 2 words. Rule 2. Warden did not hesitate. It activated Protocol Echo. Across the galaxy, in places the hegemony thought were empty, things began to stir. In a junkyard orbiting the dead moon of Varus, a rusted freighter named Dawn Chaser powered up its comms array. On a mining platform near the edge of known space, a child's toy robot, taken as a curiosity by a Cathar collector, suddenly played a lullaby in English. In a salvage yard on Xylos Prime, a human tablet long thought dead lit up and displayed a single line. Rule number 1, never surrender your future. None of these devices carried weapons. None held viruses. They held memory. And memory in the right hands could be louder than any bomb. The Dawn Chaser, once used to haul grain between Earth and Mars, now drifted near the hegemony's forward staging grounds. Its engines were cold, its hull scarred, but its broadcast system had been rigged before the final battle. A single command from Warden was all it needed. With a hum that hadn't been heard in years, it sent out a message on every open frequency, military, civilian, even diplomatic bands. Rule number 1, never surrender your future. The transmission lasted only 3 seconds before hegemony jammers cut it off. But 3 seconds was enough. Aboard the Iron Maw, Kyle was elbow deep in a coolant valve when the ship's comms crackled. He wasn't supposed to be listening. Maintenance crews had no access to main channels, but he'd rewired a spare headset to pick up stray signals. And there it was, a human voice, calm and clear, speaking words he hadn't heard since basic training. His hands froze. His breath caught. He knew what came next. In the archive wing, Lena heard it too. She was sorting files when the overhead speakers, normally silent, suddenly played the same phrase. A Cathar overseer rushed in, barking orders to shut it down, but the damage was done. Dozens of humans had heard it. And in their eyes, something flickered back to life. That night, Kyle found a way to meet Lena again. He used a broken waste chute as a shortcut, crawling through narrow pipes until he reached a disused storage room near her sector. She was already there, holding a small device made from spare parts. "They're waking up," she whispered. Warden heard us. Kyle nodded. "We need to find the full text of the Omega Directive. Not just pieces, all of it." Lena handed him the device. "I've been copying what I can. The full rule number 2 is hidden in the ship's central archive. It's locked behind a biokey, but I think I can get us in during the next shift change." Kyle studied the device. It was crude but clever, a patchwork of human and hegemony parts designed to mimic an authorized datapad. "You're sure?" "I'm sure," she said. "They think archives are just for dead things, but ours are alive." The next day, during a routine power shift, Lena slipped into the central archive. Kyle created a distraction by triggering a false alarm in the engine room, just a small overload that made lights flicker and sent guards running. While they were gone, Lena reached the core terminal. Her hands shook as she plugged in the fake pad. The screen flashed red, then green. Access granted. There it was, the full Omega Directive. 3 rules written not in code but in plain language, meant to be understood by anyone who read them. Rule number 1, never surrender your future. Rule 2, never let your enemy define your story. Rule 3, leave the door open for those who come after you. Lena read them twice, then copied the entire file onto a microchip. As she turned to leave, she saw something else. A note attached to rule number 2, dated the day Earth fell. It said, "If they think they've won, remind them they never knew the game." She tucked the chip into her sleeve and slipped out just as guards returned. Back in the engine tunnels, Kyle waited. When Lena handed him the chip, he didn't speak. He just held it like it was something holy. That night, they began to plan. The Iron Maw had a central broadcast node, used for fleet-wide announcements. If they could reach it, they could send a message not just to the ship but to every hegemony world linked to the network. It wouldn't be a weapon. It would be a mirror. And sometimes the truth is sharper than any blade. They knew the risk. If caught, they would be erased. No trial, no record, just gone. But as Kyle looked at the chip in his palm, he remembered the faces of his crew, the smell of rain on Earth, the sound of children laughing in a world that still believed in tomorrow. The hegemony thought they had won because they saw ruins and silence. But they didn't understand that humans build their strongest walls not with stone, but with stories. And the story wasn't over yet. Kyle and Lena moved like shadows through the Iron Maw's lower decks. The ship was never truly quiet. There was always the hum of engines, the hiss of vents, the distant clang of metal. But some hours were quieter than others. They chose the third watch cycle, when most guards rotated and the alien crews were deep in their rest cycles. It was the best time to be unseen. Their plan was simple but dangerous. They needed to reach the central broadcast node, a sealed chamber near the command spine of the ship. From there, they could override the hegemony's comms lock and send a message across the entire network. Not a virus, not a bomb, just words, the right words. Kyle led the way, using his knowledge of the maintenance tunnels to avoid patrols. He had spent weeks memorizing every turn, every grate, every blind spot in the security grid. Lena followed close behind, her heart pounding but her steps steady. She carried the microchip with the Omega directive, tucked inside a hollowed-out ration bar, something no guard would bother to inspect twice. They passed through a junction where coolant pipes crossed overhead. Kyle paused, listening. Footsteps, 2 guards speaking in low Cathar clicks. He signaled Lena to freeze. They pressed against the wall, barely breathing as the guards walked past without looking down. When the coast was clear, they moved again. Soon they reached a sealed hatch marked with a red symbol, restricted access. This was the outer door to the broadcast wing. Kyle pulled a small tool from his belt and began working on the lock. It was an old human design, disguised under hegemony plating. He twisted the pins just right, and with a soft click, the hatch opened. Inside, the air was cooler. Blue lights lined the floor, guiding the way to the core chamber. The walls were lined with data conduits pulsing faintly with energy. At the end of the corridor stood the broadcast node, a circular room with a single console in the center, surrounded by screens showing fleet status, comms traffic, and live feeds from 100 worlds. Lena stepped forward. This is it. Kyle nodded. You do the upload. I'll watch the door. She sat at the console and inserted the microchip. The screen flickered, then asked for a biokey. She placed her thumb on the scanner, something she'd copied from a dead officer's glove days ago. The system hesitated, then accepted it. Lines of code scrolled across the screen. She selected fleet-wide broadcast and cued the Omega directive. But she didn't stop there. She added something else. Audio files Warden had sent through the Dawn Chaser. Voices of humans, a child singing, an old man telling a story, a pilot's last log before her ship went dark. All of it wrapped around the 3 rules. Outside, Kyle heard boots. More than 2 this time. He crouched behind a conduit bank and gripped a metal rod he'd taken from the engine room. His palms were sweaty, but his mind was clear. He knew this might be the end, but if the message got out, it would be worth it. The door hissed open. 3 Cathar guards stepped in, weapons raised. They spotted Lena at the console and shouted. Kyle didn't wait. He lunged, swinging the rod at the nearest guard's knee. There was a sharp crack and the alien howled, stumbling back. The second guard fired, but the blast scorched the wall beside Kyle's head. He ducked, rolled, and came up behind the third guard, yanking the weapon from its grip. Lena didn't look up. Her fingers flew across the keys. Almost there, she muttered. 1 guard charged her. Kyle tackled him from the side, and they crashed into a bank of monitors. Glass shattered. Sparks flew. The remaining guard aimed at Lena, but Kyle threw the stolen weapon like a club. It struck the alien's wrist and the gun clattered to the floor. Lena hit send. For a heartbeat, nothing happened. Then every screen in the room lit up with the same message. Rule number 2, never let your enemy define your story. At the same moment, across the hegemony, chaos began. On the capital world of Cathar Prime, a public plaza screen, usually showing victory parades, suddenly displayed a human grandmother braiding her granddaughter's hair, while a voice said, "You forgot rule number 2. In a military academy on Xylos, training drones froze mid-drill as every speaker played the same phrase in 10 languages. On a slave transport near the Outer Rim, prisoners heard it through broken earpieces and began to chant. The message wasn't harmful. It didn't crash systems or fry circuits, but it planted doubt, and doubt, in an empire built on fear and certainty, was more dangerous than any weapon. Aboard the Iron Maw, alarms finally blared. Red lights spun, doors sealed automatically. Commander Vraktal stormed onto the bridge, his scales dark with rage. "Find them," he snarled. "Kill them." Erase every trace, but it was too late. The broadcast had already spread. And once an idea is loose in the galaxy, no wall can hold it. Back in the broadcast chamber, Kyle helped Lena to her feet. Blood trickled from a cut on her forehead, but she was smiling. "It's out there," she said. Guards were closing in from both ends of the corridor. There was no escape. Kyle knew that. But he also knew something else. As long as the message lived, they had already won. He took Lena's hand. "Then let's make sure they remember who sent it." They stood together as the doors burst open. Fractal himself entered, flanked by elite warriors. He looked at the screens, still showing human faces and the words of Rule Number 2, and his eyes burned with fury. "You think this changes anything?" He spat. "You are insects. Your words mean nothing." Kyle met his gaze. "You thought you won when you took our cities. But you forgot Rule Number 2? Fractal raised his weapon. But before he could fire, the lights in the room flickered, then turned deep red. Not from damage, from command. The ship's own systems were waking up. Doors slammed shut behind the guards. Gravity plating shifted, throwing 2 warriors off their feet. Conduits sparked, and emergency protocols, hidden in the ship's code since the day human tech was first copied, activated one by one. The Iron Maw, built on stolen human designs, was turning against its masters. And in that moment, Kyle and Lena knew the tide had turned. Not with fire, not with force, but with a truth the hegemony could not unhear. They had reminded the galaxy that humans were more than ruins. They were a story that refused to end. The Iron Maw shuddered as its own systems turned against it. Lights pulsed red. Doors locked. Gravity shifted in sudden, disorienting waves. Commander Vractal roared in fury as his warriors stumbled, their weapons slipping from their claws. The ship, built with stolen human blueprints, wired with copied logic and powered by designs it never truly understood, was waking up to its hidden roots. Kyle and Lena didn't run. They stood in the center of the broadcast chamber, hands still linked, watching as the Cathar commander struggled against a rebellion not of flesh, but of code and memory. The screens around them no longer showed fleet status or enemy positions. Instead, they played looping images. Earth's oceans at sunrise, children planting seeds in ruined soil, old men playing chess in refugee camps, soldiers sharing rations under alien stars. And over it all, the words repeated in calm, clear voices. Rule Number 2. Never let your enemy define your story. Vractal turned to Kyle, his eyes blazing. "You did this," he hissed. "No," Kyle said. "You did. You took our tech, our cities, our people, but you never asked why we built them the way we did. You thought copying the shape meant you owned the soul." Before Vractal could respond, the floor beneath him tilted sharply. He fell to one knee, snarling. Alarms blared in a dozen languages. Across the ship, human laborers, once silent and broken, began to move. Some opened emergency panels they'd secretly memorized. Others used smuggled tools to cut power to guard stations. A few simply stood tall for the first time in months, meeting the eyes of their overseers without fear. The rebellion wasn't violent. It didn't need to be. The hegemony's control had always been built on the belief that humans were defeated. Now that belief was crumbling. Far beyond the Iron Maw, the message spread like wildfire. On a dozen occupied worlds, humans who had been silent for years began to speak. They gathered in courtyards, in mines, in prison yards, and recited the 3 rules. Alien overseers tried to silence them, but the words had already taken root. Even among the hegemony's own subject species, those who had suffered under Cathar rule for centuries, something stirred. If humans could resist without weapons, maybe they could too. On Cathar Prime, the ruling council convened in panic. Reports flooded in. Drones refusing commands, translation systems glitching into human poetry. Even ceremonial statues of past conquerors displaying human faces for 3 seconds at dawn. The Empire's unity, once ironclad, began to crack. Back aboard the Iron Maw, Kyle and Lena were found not by guards but by other humans, former engineers, medics, pilots, who had waited for a sign. Together they rerouted power to life support and sealed off command sections. The ship was no longer a prison. It was becoming a refuge. Warden, deep beneath Earth's ice, continued its work. It sent new signals, not just to ghost ships, but to every piece of human-made tech still floating in hegemony space. Toys, tools, tablets, even kitchen appliances began to hum with quiet defiance. The galaxy learned that human culture wasn't just in books or buildings. It was in the way a coffee maker beeped, the rhythm of a lullaby, the design of a doorknob. All of it carried the same quiet message: we are still here. Weeks passed. The hegemony tried to contain the uprising, but it was like trying to hold back the tide with bare hands. Subject species rose up on 3 core worlds. Trade routes collapsed as workers refused to load ships carrying human-made goods. Even some Cathar officers began to question their leaders. How could a species they thought extinct still speak through their own machines? Then came the day the first diplomatic shuttle arrived at Earth's orbit. It wasn't a warship. It was small, unarmed, painted white with a single green leaf on its side, the symbol of the Veln, a peaceful species long forced into silence by the hegemony. They came not to fight, but to listen. Kyle and Lena stood on a newly rebuilt orbital platform watching the shuttle dock. Earth below was still scarred, but green shoots pushed through the ash. Farms were returning. Schools were reopening, and in every settlement people spoke the rules, not as secrets but as promises. The Veln envoy was an old woman named Tira. She stepped onto the platform and looked at Kyle and Lena with eyes full of wonder. "We heard the message," she said. "We thought it was a trick, but then we saw what it did to our own people. It made us remember who we were before the hegemony came." Lena smiled. "That's what rule number 2 is for." Tira nodded slowly. "Your empire didn't win with weapons. It won with meaning." "We don't have an empire," Kyle said. "We just have a story, and we're sharing it." Over the next months, more ships came, not to conquer, not to take, but to learn. Humans taught them how to build with care, not just strength, how to design machines that remembered kindness, not just function, how to tell stories that healed instead of divided. The Cathar Dominion, once unshakable, fractured from within. Some clans surrendered, others vanished into deep space. The hegemony didn't fall in a great battle. It faded like a shadow when the light returns. Years later, Kyle would walk through a rebuilt Chicago, past parks where children played under real sunlight. Lena would teach history again, but now her classroom included students from a dozen worlds, all eager to understand how a broken species had changed the galaxy with 3 simple rules. And whenever someone asked what rule number 2 truly meant, they would say the same thing. It means you decide who you are, not your enemy, not your past, not even your pain. The war was over. Not because humans had the biggest ships or the strongest guns, but because they refused to let anyone else write their ending. And in the quiet hum of a million machines across the stars, Earth's story continued, not as a warning, but as a welcome.